Hey guys, so lately I've been doing quite a lot of watercolor sketches of doors, windows and such, and so today I decided that I will film myself painting using watercolor a door. So it's a very old door of a castle in France, and so if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and maybe sharing on social networks so that it can get through to more people. Thanks a lot and enjoy. Okay, so here you can see a few of my other sketches of doors and windows, and this is the sketch we are going to work on today. So on the left there's a street view in south of France, and on the right is the sketch of the door that I'm going to be working on today, and it's like a very old door. It is a castle somewhere in France, but I don't, quite frankly, I do not remember very well where it was. It's a picture I took a long time ago. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to sketch over the top of my pencil drawing using a fine liner. So it's a permanent fine liner, which means that I will be able to sketch and then paint on the top of it using watercolor without the ink getting diluted all over the page. So it's very handy to do these architectural sketches. Also, if you like to do like a sketchbook during a trip somewhere, well, it's a very nice tool to have, because very easily your sketches, even the loose sketches, are going to look a lot sharper and a lot nicer. So I'm going to draw like this sculptured stones around the door, and there is this family sign above the door. We can see it's like a sculpted stone as well. And also in front of the door we have these big flat stones on the floor, which are they actually have a little bit of mold and vegetation on the edges between the stones. So this is something I will be needing to paint. And also you will notice later on that around the door the stones have different colors, and this reflects actually the type of stones. So the ones that are sculpted, they are like white yellowish, because it's like a soft sandstone that is easy to sculpt. And then the bottom of the walls and the big cornerstones of the door frame, they are made using granite, which is like gray and dark. So it gives us two very different colors, and that's the first thing I would like to paint. So I will first use a round brush and a yellow, just to paint on the top of all the stones that are going to be yellowish. So it's all the sculpted ones on the inside of the door frame. And then I will use like a mix of brown and blue, just so that I can have like a nice gray color. And I'm going to do the bottom stones with them, and also the pavement on the floor. So that's very loose at the moment, but it just gives a nice division between what is going to be yellowish made with sandstone, and then the granite stones. I am also going to use a little bit of a more saturated paint to give a little bit of shade, so that you can suggest like shapes and three-dimensional, give a three-dimensional look of the sketch. And also I'm going to give a little brown shade on the door. And so what I would like to do as well is just to wet the family sign on top, and then remove the paint, because it's it's made in a very clear sandstone, so it's almost white. And I will give a little bit of shade at the bottom so that it pops out. And that's the first step, and now it's quite important to let it dry completely before adding more details. The only thing I'm going to do before I let it dry is I'm going to add a little bit more of shade, a darker shade, just so that I can suggest the direction of the sunlight, and also make it more obvious that these sculpted stones are on the inside, and they are like, so the door is like, there's like a little porch in front. Okay, so let's just let it dry for now. You can take the time to let it dry, or you can use a hair dryer, of course. And then I'm going to take this little brush, which is going to be very handy to add a little bit more detail. And I just took a light blue shade, and I'm going to use it to give a little bit more detail on the pavement, on the ground, and also the gray stones. All right. So I'm going just to paint on the top of it, because the previous layer of paint is already dry, so I can paint on the top of it without being scared that the watercolor is going to become muddy. If the bottom paint, the first layer of paint, is not completely dry, then you do have a real danger that the watercolor is going to become muddy, so it's really important to wait for it to dry. I'm going to use a gray shade as well to paint the stones of the arch, surrounding the arch. And basically at this stage I'm simply going to add a little bit more shade so that I can give a little bit more detail on the sculpted stones, but also the door. So the door is made of timber, and it's sculpted because that was like at this time their only way to have like a big door of timber was like to make panels of smaller wood pieces and put it together after that. So that's why it's quite important to give detail on these panels and show how the actual door has been made. So I'm going to do that with different shades of brown as well. And I'm going to try to give a little bit of volume on some of the, like, I don't know if you can see it yet, but we have like this flower pot on the front. I just let it white for now. And so now I'm going to give a little bit more color on this door. It's a bit of a more saturated and warm brown. I'm going to let it dry before I add a little bit of darker brown to give the shade and to give the shape of the wood panels. And so when you draw with a little brush like that, it's very easy to let dry because you can just go and paint somewhere else. So for now I'll just leave the wood panels dry, and I will use a yellowish color to give a little bit more of saturated patches here and there on the stone wall, which is going to give a nicer feel, because when we have these yellow patches, they will give us the impression that there's more sunlight and the colors are more saturated. But I'm still not using very dark and saturated colors. I like to start with like very light washes first, and then I tend to add a little bit of more saturated colors on the top, exactly as I'm doing now. And then when this is done, I would add just a little bit of details with darker colors and shades. If you go with the dark colors right on, the danger is to put too much of it. So in watercolor, I find it very important to have some areas where the colors are dark and saturated, and other areas where it's much lighter and the colors are fading away. so it does give a little bit more contrast, and overall the watercolor sketch looks nicer, I think. So now I'm adding a dark gray around the door, so it does give the impression of you know, a door that doesn't fit precisely its frame because it's such an old door. So we can see the shade of the inside, the interior, around the edges of the door. And again, I will use a little bit of these warmer shades to add a little bit of detail on the sculpted stones. And so once I'm happy with the drawing, the next step is going to be to add a little bit of color on the pavement in particular. And as I mentioned earlier, there is this kind of mold in between the different pavements, so I'm going to suggest it with a greenish color, just like that. It doesn't have to be very strong, but it does need to be there. And so also on the basement of this stone wall, we are going to have the same mold going up. So I'm going to use a dry brush with a little bit of color on it, and just do those very brief strokes on the bottom of the wall, so that it does give a little bit of texture without adding too much color. And I think it's not too bad, but I still do think that this sketch needs a little bit of more contrast. And so what I would like to do is that I will use quite a dark and saturated blue color, and also I will use my pen to add a little bit of black here and there. And now I'll use my blue to add darker shades in some areas. I often use either blue or purple for the shades, for the darkest shades. And it's very handy to draw attention to some details that we want to make more prominent on the sketch. I think it's almost there. I hope you enjoyed this quick watercolor sketch. If you did, do not hesitate to share this video on social networks so that more people can see it. And do not hesitate to subscribe as well, because I try to publish a video like this, a watercolor sketch like this one, every week or so. So thanks for watching, and see you next week.